Welcome to The Revolution Will Be Messy, a podcast to address the messiness of the moment with your hosts Renee Lemus and Cynthia Silverstein. Come along as they sift through the murky waters of current political topics on their journey toward collective liberation.
Alrighty.
Oh, we're recording. Okay. All right, let me wake up. I have these moments of like, oh, sleep.
I know, me too. Well, you especially because you were
was
partying it up last night.
partying it up.
So let's dive into it. I think we've been really wanting to kind of talk about this. I think since the beginning we've really kind of connected on terminology and like people throwing around all these different words and kind of with a lack of context and a lack of like a deeper understanding of these things. And I, like I said before, I didn't necessarily have like the historical context of the Middle East, but I understood colonization and I have a deep understanding of that. So when I was like, as I was like diving into understanding the region and filtering it through what I understand about colonization, I was like, this sounds really familiar, or this sounds very similar to things that I know. So I think I was able to kind of get a grasp on things because of that. And then again, like hearing these arguments, like, how is it colonization if, Jews are indigenous to the Middle East? And it was like, ooh, well, colonization, So yeah, I think let's talk about that, like what colonization is and isn't. And I think for me, and maybe you can speak to, because I know we early on had talked about too, like colonization versus settler colonialism, right? And I think for me, either way, the way I've come to understand colonization, it's like not just about an empire coming into a land and like taking land and resources, but really about colonizing the mind and colonizing ways of being and ways of knowing and ways of understanding, right? Like it's a mindset, right? Like white supremacy, patriarchy, those are all colonial ideas that have become so institutionalized within our society that we just see those things as normal, right? Like they just are what they are. And I think that that's the part that I feel is missing sometimes in the conversation when people say like, how can this be colonization? And I'm like, well, it's the very notion that that you can own land, right? Like that's a colonial mindset, right? Because that was indigenous people don't see land in that way. Like they see land as as just a part of the world, as a part of the universe, right? As a relative, right? And so just that mindset, like colonization is ideological. It's a way of relating to the world. And I think hierarchical structures is one of those things, right?
Primarily, yes.
Right, like that we understand the world in terms of a hierarchy. Patriarchy is a hierarchy. Racism is a hierarchy.
Yeah, and everyone fits in a particular spot, and that's it.
And that's just normal. That's just what it is. And we should just, like, that's just how life is, right? Like, and it's biological, right? It's biological, it's innate. And I think because of that, those hierarchies, colonization also normalizes cycles of violence, right? But not just in terms of these like global wars, right? If you even want to call it that, but like it's normalizes cycles of violence even in like families and interpersonal relationships, right? The idea that the parents are the authority, right?
Well, part of that hierarchy, if you have somebody above you, they have something to say about what you do, and we're supposed to just go along with it.
And if your children don't comply, you can then violently
use physical force to make them.
Right. And I mean, that is not a natural way of parenting. Right? Like that's not a natural way. Or the idea of like a husband is somehow, the authority within a
Mhm.
marriage. And again, that if the wife doesn't do what they say, right, then they can violently,
Put them in
impose.
line.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean those, and we can laugh at it, but like this was normalized. And I
This is
think in
very
so
normal.
many ways it's still normalized, right? Like when
Oh, for
people
sure.
want to say, "Oh, I'm not abusing my child. I'm just spanking them,"
Correcting their behavior.
yeah, to teach them a lesson. And it's like, no, actually that's really violence, which,
Mhm.
that's a whole other topic. But I think I point that out to show the ways in which we like normalize these things, normalize these um like dynamics of violence and dynamics of domination, and recognizing that in and of itself is a colonial mindset. So that's colonization, right?
Yeah,
So the
even the
fact
way that
that
we see things and define things, I think.
mm, mhm,
A lot
mhm.
of the work that I'm doing right now, it's a lot of, like, grappling with there's nothing that I can see, like, literally in front of me that is not going to be influenced by the colonial system. I
Mhm.
can't define the world around me without it because that's how the world around me was created. And so
Mm,
it's like that innate, that, part of, like, our normal, like, biological process even because we don't know any other way. That's
yeah.
how we've been socialized, in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I mean, I talk about this in my classes in terms of gender, right? Like the idea that we understand gender only through the binary, right? Like man,
Mhm.
woman. That's a colonial ideology. The
Yeah,
idea that gender only lands on this binary, when we know so many indigenous communities around the world understood gender beyond, right? Like had infinite gender,
I think that's
right?
one of the biggest things that colonialism has given us is, like, a binary thinking across the board.
Yeah.
Something either is this or is that, and there's nothing in between.
Exactly, right? It's either good or bad, right?
Yeah.
There's and I think, that's why even what we're sort of witnessing is so hard for people too, because there has to be a bad guy.
Yeah.
There has to, and the opposite of the bad guy is innately the good guy, right?
Mhm.
We talk about this all the
Yeah.
time, like what is it, the enemy of my enemy is my
Like,
friend. Like that
yeah.
kind of binary thinking is like, whoa, like that's kind of scary.
Yeah, but colonialism doesn't work if we don't have that, I don't think.
Right.
Right? If we don't have
Exactly.
that binary.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so I think that that gets us into the other thing that colonialism, like part of this way is knowing, is this idea that freedom and safety is contingent on violence,
Mhm. Which
right? Like,
I'm
yeah,
like, doesn't that you just even hearing you say it right now, I'm like, that makes no sense.
it makes no sense. And here, like saying it that way, most people would be like, no, that's not true. But then when we look at the reality
Yeah.
of things like, I mean, because what are we told as Americans about our military? Oh, the military is fighting for our freedoms,
Yeah.
right? Like we should honor soldiers because they're out there fighting for our freedoms. I always say, I always laugh and be like, whose freedom?
Yeah.
Are you free? Because I don't feel that free.
Those soldiers aren't even free. There's like
The soldiers aren't even that free, right? But the idea that I mean, even just think, breaking down, what is the military? The military is innately a violent entity, because when
Mhm.
somebody goes into the military, they have to go through boot camp training. And what does that do? I've always said that boot camp and those kinds of military training actually dehumanizes them. They have to
Yeah,
be dehumanized
you have
so
to.
that they can go and kill other people, right? You
Yeah.
can't have humanity and empathy if you're going to go into other countries and
Mhm.
commit acts of violence. So you have to dehumanize the soldier, and when you dehumanize the soldier, it makes it that much easier for them to then like the whole purpose of the military is to be violent, and then we're
Mhm.
told that the military is protecting our freedom, therefore our freedom is contingent on violence. Like,
Violence. Mhm. It doesn't make sense. It's kind of like I just read, was it today or yesterday, that Tennessee passed a law that teachers can now carry concealed firearms,
oh yes,
and I was like,
what
"Ha
the fuck is
thi this is so, like, the opposite of what needs to happen to keep children safe." because
Yeah.
the minute that you have access to these kinds of things, the more reactionary you are, which is why so many soldiers end up being very reactionary when they're actually out in the field, because there's no actual, because you are so dehumanized. Once you like receive the training and you have the expectation of I need to be able to defend my life,
Mhm.
I think personally it must become the biggest like difficulty mentally to be able not to be constantly reactionary.
Well, I mean, this is why we see so many soldiers coming back, not just with PTSD, but high rates of domestic violence when they
Mhm.
come back from, combat because it's again, your mind has been so trained to use violence in this reactionary way, even within like how do you can't just turn that off all of a sudden, right?
Yeah,
Like if you've been so trained to react this way, and you're gonna go into like your interpersonal relationships, like that's not gonna go away. And so
yeah.
yeah, it's
You
gonna
can't
come
shut it
out.
off.
Yeah, you can't turn that off. And so um I just think that like when we say that, right, when we sort of make that argument that, colonization has us thinking that our freedom and our safety, like it's not just about freedom, but the
No,
idea
it's
that
the safety part, yeah.
what keeps us safe is somehow violence against others, but all of that is justified under the guise of, well, they're out there fighting some bad guy,
Mhm. Far
right?
removed from where I am, yeah.
Yeah, out of sight, out of mind, right? They're
Mhm.
fighting some bad guy to protect our freedom and safety when history has told us
Mm.
time and time again that that is not the case. But somehow this is different. Like now it's different.
Yeah, I always get so stuck when people say that. I was like, yeah, like, why is this time different? How
Mm.
are we like, why are we so exceptional in this moment right now that the thing that has literally happened for centuries is not gonna happen to us for some reason? I
Yeah.
don't understand.
We were talking about like the protesters, and you see a lot of these protesters, and the images are very similar to like the Vietnam War protests,
Mhm.
right? And you know, at the time, there was all kinds of justifications to be in Vietnam, just like there were justifications to be in, after 9/11 to be
Anywhere
wherever
else,
the
yeah.
yeah. And then now we look back and we're like, "Oh shit, you know what?
Yeah,
We we
we
we
were
really
wrong for
shouldn't."
this
Yeah, we
happened.
were wrong.
We
And
shouldn't have.
we perpetuated all this like, mass death and violence. And I'm like, that's what military in fact, they didn't get it wrong. They were doing
Well, they were doing what, yeah,
what they were supposed to,
they
like,
were doing what they're supposed to do.
that's what they were doing, right? Like, I think it's the way that we are told to, like, it's the way that we are convinced to,
Mhm.
like, get behind, right, these wars is like, "Oh, they're
Yeah.
protecting our safety." Um, and I think that, like and again, it institutionalizes to the point where not only do we, like, not realize that it's not normal, right? It's
Mhm.
not normal to use violence to protect us. But then we can't even imagine any other way to stay safe or free. Like we can't think
Yeah,
like when
there's no, well, we don't have an imagination past that. I mean, like, I read somewhere today, I think, like, war is ultimately a choice, right?
Mhm.
And somebody at some point has to make the choice not to do it, but it's seen as such a weakness that
Mm,
nobody could possibly, with the system that's in place right now, make that choice that needs to be made. If one side was like, "No, I don't wanna do this anymore, I'm done. It's okay."
yeah.
There would the fear would be so intense that I don't know, I think people would like not be okay with it because we would it would be hard for some people to even get behind that notion. If a
Yeah.
government all of a sudden was like, "Oh, we're not going to do war anymore." There's so many people would be like,
Would freak
"No,
out.
yeah, you have to."
Yeah.
Um but it is ultimately a choice, and colonialism and how deep rooted it is, it doesn't allow us to make that choice
Mm,
necessarily.
yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that you say like not to choose war is equated to weakness. And I think it also like, this is where intersectionality comes in, right? Because colonialism is a project, right? Colonization is a project. It's not, it's an ongoing project,
Mhm.
that is intrinsically linked to white supremacy and patriarchy. And so I always kind of make this connection between war, violence, and toxic masculinity,
Mhm.
obviously, right?
Mhm.
And so it's interesting, this idea that to not choose war is to choose weakness, because femininity is so equated to weakness and the idea of inferiority. So it would be like, and this is why we always are saying, oh, we need, this is why we don't have a woman president, right? Because how can a woman lead our country and make the hard choices? Essentially what they're saying is, how can a woman make the choice to go to
Yeah.
war when they're gonna, all those misogynistic things. But
But
like,
it's so misogynistic because it doesn't even allow for the possibility that a woman can be so indoctrinated into the patriarchy that,
which
of
they
course,
would
they will
be.
make that choice to go to war.
Exactly. I mean, Hillary Clinton would have been doing exactly what
Yeah.
Biden's doing. I mean, I have no doubt, right? Like, exactly. That's the ironic thing about it, is like, no, they're also so indoctrinated into it. They would still be going to war because that's how toxic masculinity works. And that's how colonization works too, right? Because that even the colonized
Mhm.
buy into the ideology of colonization, right?
Mhm.
That we, because colonization wouldn't work or hasn't worked, um, just because of the oppressor. There's
Yeah.
had to be a certain amount of buy-in from
Yeah.
the colonized in order for it to be able to continue, right? That is the project of colonization, that it convinces us, the colonized, that
Mhm.
this is the only way to be, even if we suffer under that system.
Mhm. Yeah. Even if we're, like, daily feeling the weight, there's no yeah, I mean, I just go back to choice. I was like, we often feel like, well, we don't have the choice for it to be anything different. We've been
Yeah.
so suppressed and oppressed
Mhm.
that making a choice to do something it's almost like it's too hard. Like, just let me keep
Yeah.
suffering and living my life
Yeah.
because it's like ready made. I don't have to think about it.
I don't have to think about it. And I think even when you were saying, like, the idea of, like, if they chose not to go to war, people would freak out. And so it gives people a sense of comfort.
Yeah.
Again, even in that, like, oppression, it's like, well, at least it's not that bad, right?
Yeah,
Like, it could be worse, right?
could be
This
worse.
boogeyman can come after us, right?
Mhm.
And at least the violence is going in that direction,
Yeah.
right? Like, I don't it's I mean, and again, it sounds kind of, like, crazy when you break it down
When
that
you
way.
break it down and you, like, just say it straight, it sounds insane.
Yeah.
Like, we could read it so I'm watching X-Men '97, and
Same, same. I'm catching all the, like, tidbits as my kids are watching it.
but I was like, as we're watching this, we can go well, if you're, like, thinking critically, that's the caveat.
Of course.
You can watch it and go, This is so stupid. Why are these people making this choice? Why are they
Mm,
choosing to, like, walk right into this war? Or why are they making this choice
mm.
to, like, just go along with this person?" And yet,
We
like,
do it.
we do it all the time. It's like, "Okay, I'll turn off the TV, and then people will just, like, participate in the exact same thing that they're, like, yelling at." Um, yeah, it just I've been thinking a lot about how we recognize it, how we see it in the world, how we can talk about it. So I
Yeah.
was so glad to talk about it today because I do think that a lot of people hear these words and they seem so abstract,
Mhm.
even though it's so clear that it's just hard to, like, apply.
Yeah. Well, I think it's like, it's easy to say, okay, colonization, because this is something that I've heard a lot, this idea that what's happening in the Middle East is not the same as what has happened in the United States, right? Like, you can't compare the two. And, just because colonization looks like this idea that you can't compare the two. And I'm like, I get it, right? I'm sure there's historical regional contexts
Sure.
that need to be considered. At the same time, we can't deny that that the same empires
Mhm.
that influenced US colonization
The
are
exact
not
same.
the same empires
Yeah.
that are influencing colonization in the Middle East, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's it's really, yeah, like, a lot of people have had pushback because when you talk about settler colonialism, there are 3 nations that always come up: Israel, the United States, and Australia,
Mm,
because those are ones that were, sort of governed by someone off-site.
mhm,
People did not, like, the governing body did not move their location to
mhm,
the place that they were settling.
mhm,
Um, and people see it very differently, but if you really look at the basic facts, which is all that these, like, the terminology tries to do, it tries to give us some sort of, like, basis for understanding of these processes, right? And as humans, I think, like, that's so natural. We want to understand why things happen. So I have a hard time with people being so offended by it because I'm like, what if you just listened? What if you just listened about, like, just basic facts, like basic
mhm,
categorical facts, and think about how the process is applied to these 3 locations at least. There are
mm,
absolutely contextual differences. Clearly, things turned out differently in all of them, but the actual, like, movement was spelled out by every single
mhm.
colonizer that moved to these places. So why can't we just listen to them and think about these similarities and then think about where we are after it's all happened?
Yeah. But I think that's the hard part for people. I mean, I think it's the hard part for anyone when we talk about systems of oppression, it's just like when we talk about racism or sexism and people want to be like, "Oh, I'm not racist. I can't be racist because," and they give their litany of
Mhm.
reasons why. And it's like, what if we just said, "You know what? I think maybe I am." Like, like just and recognize that by no fault of your own, right? Like
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think for us to have to admit is like to admit our complicity, and that's really hard for people is to
yeah,
admit
and
their
that's the
complicity
barrier.
in these systems because then they have to like change their behavior and they have to change their ideas and that can be really difficult. I mean, I think you and I have talked about that times in our own lives where we've had to be like,
Yeah,
oh shit, like, the US is a colonizing country, and even though we've been sold since the beginning of our education that
yeah,
the United States are inherently the good guys, and we escaped, our forefathers escaped religious persecution and blah blah, and our forefathers created the Constitution based on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all of this rhetoric, but all of that was underlying like indigenous
mhm.
genocide and enslavement of Africans.
Even
Like it
yeah.
all was contingent on that.
Oh, man, yeah, and definitely, I think that gets a barrier for folks to go, "Okay, well, the minute that I hear this definition, it's gonna require me to think about myself."
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know, I'm, like, hoping that we can get to a place where people are a little bit more open, and like you said, like, it it's no fault of anyone that we have an education system that does not teach us these things and that actually probably teaches us the opposite.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's not our fault. But again, like, I keep going back to choice, but I feel like I want to encourage people to make the choice to just listen and see and think about it
Yeah.
and not necessarily like self-reflect in that moment, you know? I know it's
Yeah.
hard. Like, how do we get to a place where like your immediate reaction isn't defense? I don't
I
know.
mean, that's a whole lot of like therapy. But I mean, I think I really want to kind of before we move on to like talking about genocide, think
Oh,
about like that argument of when people say, how can Jews be colonizers in the
ugh,
state of Israel when they are indigenous to the land? Like,
this came up last night at the Seder.
so what I mean, how do we use like the way that we're talking about colonization to address like something like that?
Ooh, man, that's such a hard one, and, like, yesterday we didn't even get it was a really interesting moment because we had a Muslim woman at the Seder,
Mm.
and, you know, Passover is about liberation,
Mhm.
and there are very, very pointed passages that you're supposed to read that speak very specifically about what it's like to be oppressed and
Mhm.
how great it is to be free, and very much mirror what is currently happening. And it's really hard to not make that connection. And
Mhm.
she sort of kind of like stopped the 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 reading and was like, do Jews not see? Like, can you not hear these words and see?" And first of all, we're like, "Well, we do."
Yeah.
But the conversation sort of came to, there are a lot of folks that read those words and see themselves still being oppressed
Mhm.
because the way that things have developed in the creation of this like Israeli national myth, it is inherent in that story to feel like you are constantly in danger. And so the attack on October 7th reads to a lot of people as this is still oppression
Mhm.
because people are stepping into my safety zone and
Mhm.
demanding that I not exist or exist differently.
Mhm.
And so it becomes very hard to then go, "Oh, but do you see that that can be true? And also you are then shifting that over here and oppressing
Mhm.
people to guarantee your safety," because it's almost like it's so hyper focused
Mm.
on that feeling of, well, I'm still being subjugated in this way.
Mhm.
I can't even think that I can possibly be subjugating somebody else.
Yeah, I was hearing somebody talk about it in terms of, like, zero sum, the
Yeah.
idea that, like,
Mm.
there's only one oppressor and one oppressed, right? Like, that they
Yeah.
and that I mean, we've talked about this too in terms of intersectionality, the idea that we can be both oppressed and oppressor, right? So, both of those things can be true at the same time, right? Like, Jews
Mhm.
can be, um, part of the oppressed, but and I you know, we don't wanna make these blanket statements about Jews,
No.
but the state of Israel,
State of Israel. Yeah.
who weaponizes Judaism, right?
Yeah.
Then can turn around and be the oppressor, even if they were established as a safety zone, right, against oppression, right? Like,
Yeah.
because again, it's the like you talk about, Israel's national myth. That's the same thing of the United States national myth, right?
Mhm.
The idea that the early American settlers were escaping religious persecution only to come and persecute indigenous
Yeah.
spirituality and religion. Like, they did
Yeah.
the very same thing that they were escaping because, you
And
know,
and
of
and
colonization.
and the crazy thing is that neither of their myths work unless they it's like, oh my gosh, I don't even know how to explain it. There neither national myth can exist without the erasure of another person. They don't include it, but that's like the thing that's unsaid that you go, "Oh, right, this would never have happened. This great thing that you're talking about that we're supposed to be like all in for and all about, um, could physically, ideologically never have happened unless you eliminated a whole group of people,
Mhm,
erased their culture. Because if you want to be the national myth on a land that already had people existing, obviously they have to go away. They
that
have
and
to
that's
disappear.
I think that's the thing that, like, I wonder about, those who are sort of making this argument about Jews being indigenous to, Israel, therefore cannot be colonizers. I'm like, "Okay, cool. Jews are indigenous to the land." Weren't also the Palestinians, right? Like,
Yeah, it's both.
I'm
And
like, that's the part that confused. Like, I can concede and say, even though I know that that's a complex story, but I can concede and say, "Okay, Jews are indigenous to the Middle East," but what about
The other
you know,
people that were living
the
right
other
alongside
people,
you
and,
the
like,
entire time.
and then sometimes I hear this idea of like, well, there were war and they lost the war. And I'm like, well, that's colonization.
Yeah,
The idea that somehow you go to war and, I'm like,
but
I think I say
but
like
here's the
the spoils of war, right? Like we call that freedom. Like
yeah,
the idea of like, well, they just lost, even though, and
yeah.
so we gained
So they
our
kinda
freedom.
have
And
to,
it's
like,
not our fault that they couldn't fight they couldn't fight their battles.
but even so, it's not like the Palestinians came on a ship from somewhere to, like, battle. Like,
Right, right, right.
no one came and, like, they're like, "Let's just meet here and decide who gets it." They
Yeah,
were already there.
yeah, yeah,
That,
yeah.
like, it's almost like had they not been there, the fighting would have never started. So you can't negate one's indigeneity because just logically, in order to be able to have conflict with your neighbor, you have to be neighbors, which
Right.
means you both live there and
Right.
have lived there.
Yeah. And I think too that's it's an interesting, the idea of like, because I've heard also like the idea of like, you know, Israel or Zionism as this like is actually like a decolonial project, right? Like they're decolonizing, right? Like you've heard this, right?
Yeah, I did, and
And
I almost threw my phone across the room. Like, "This is
and I'm
gonna
like,
quit the
wait a
internet."
minute. This is not what decolonization is, because again, the colonization, or the idea of being able to own land, right? To have this hierarchical relationship to land, that
Mhm.
there are borders, that is innately a colonial concept. So
Yeah.
if you're going to decolonize a land, you can't decolonize a land and put borders. Those
You
are
yes,
antithetical ideas.
you can't take
That
a
doesn't
pen to paper and then just be like, "I'm gonna draw a line right here arbitrarily and
yeah.
decolonize just this little section."
Yeah, I'm like, that it doesn't work like that, which gets us into, I think, even you talking about like the idea of like erasure, right? In order for this national myth to be possible, which gets us into genocide. And I would
Mhm.
argue, yes, that colonization is contingent on genocide. It requires genocide, right? The United States existence, it required the genocide of indigenous people in order for it to establish itself. It had,
Yeah,
it required like, and I'm not romanticizing that. I'm saying that's fucked up, right?
yeah,
Like
it's
that
completely
is the
messed up,
principle our country was built on.
and nothing works without it. Like, everything
Yeah.
falls apart without, like, when people are like, "Well, like, it wasn't actually a genocide," or they don't wanna talk about it, or we wanna have this idea that, like, somehow indigenous people here on this continent were like, "Welcome, come in, like, we'll just
The
shift over
Thanksgiving
to"
story, right?
yeah, that, or that they're like, "Okay, well, we consider ourselves caretakers of this land. Our origin stories are based on this specific place, but sure, we'll go move to what you call Oklahoma." Like,
On
we'll go.
these very delineated,
Yeah,
areas where
like,
we
we'll
don't
all
have
just kinda, like,
access to.
live here because of
um
course.
Yeah, I think that that's I mean, I heard somebody one time talk about like the Thanksgiving story and how they talk to their children about it, and I'm very much like, I don't, celebrate Thanksgiving with any kind of pilgrim story in any way. I'm like, we're celebrating fall harvest. And, but interesting, I saw like parents go back and forth, and somebody saying that they had ancestors like from the Mayflower, or I don't know, some weird shit. And that the way she talks to her kids about is, they were both sides were fighting, right? And both sides were at war. And I was like, what? Like that's the story you're telling your kids, that's like, yes, it was like violent, and yes, all these things happen, but both it's very the
Like,
Trump thing to say like
both
that
were in
there were
agreement to do it? Like, both
like
of
that
them
there
supported
wasn't
it?
this colonial relation, right? Like this idea of like, well, yes, the pilgrims might have violently, whatever, against the indigenous people, but the indigenous people also killed pilgrims. So
And it
they're both equally as bad and
that's
violent.
the
And
part that I'm like, but is it not apparent that the indigenous people were fighting against people that just randomly showed up to their house.
I
Like,
don't but
you know
that's
what's crazy? Like the stand your ground laws. Can we talk about if we were like, hey, you know how you folks in certain places
Florida.
like Florida don't want people that want to have the ability to shoot people that step on your property? I don't know. Like maybe there's something there. Like maybe there's like some sort of line
Well,
we could draw to the bigger picture. But I
theoretically there is, but you know, then there's white supremacy, right?
yeah,
Because, I mean, yeah, we talk about gun laws, but then, you know, it's okay for, white teachers to have guns, but not, black people,
yeah,
right? Like, right? Like oh no, that's where we draw our
that's
line.
really
So yeah, of course it makes sense for, white people to stand their ground, but the inverse doesn't
it
make sense,
doesn't.
right?
Yeah.
Because indigenous people are anyway. But I think when we talk about like genocide, again, I think what's really hard for me is this idea of it's not genocide because number one, there has to be intent, right? Like
Mhm.
that somehow you have to show intent. And I keep thinking within these moments that we can now look back and say unequivocally are genocide, I'm sure in the moment there were all kinds of people arguing that's not our intention, right? We didn't
Yeah,
intend to kill all these indigenous people, right? They
yeah.
just
I just
fell on
wanted
our
my house.
swords.
I just wanted a house here.
Right.
It
Or,
wasn't my fault. Yeah.
I mean, because people talk about genocide even as a term was born out of, right, the Holocaust, and
Yes.
there needing to be some kind of under name to be able to
Well, the
articulate what
atrocities
happened.
needed to be canonized in a way that there could then be some sort of system in place legally that would prevent it
Right.
from happening.
But I feel like all the times that we're able to say something is genocidal is retrospectively, right?
Mhm.
Like, and here we have, I think, this unique opportunity to be like, it is happening right now as we
Yeah,
speak. Why are we going to wait 20 years to look back and be like, oh, you know what? That was genocide, right? Like,
it's kinda like
because we're
yeah,
getting caught up in this idea of like, well, that's not their intention, right? And I'm like, so then I always answer with, does it matter what the intention when the impact is still genocide, right? The impact,
mhm,
there is mass death. At this point, I don't care what the intention is.
mhm,
There is mass death, and I keep saying like, and also it's not just about the numbers of dead bodies. It
mhm.
is about the ability to live, right? The ability to thrive, and the death of it's the killing the very notion of being a people, right? So dehumanization
Yeah.
has to occur in order for genocide to be possible. And so what do we say? We say, well, Palestinians are, I mean, I've heard all these things like are indoctrinated into anti-Semitism, and Hamas, and what is it, human shields, which it's the idea of human shields really gets to me because it feels like they put the term human there to like lessen the blow. But when you say people are shields, that is innately
Yeah.
dehumanizing, right?
Yeah.
Like just because you put the term human in front
Mhm.
of it
Yeah. No, it's still
doesn't negate the dehumanization,
yeah.
right? And so I think when you and calling them terrorists, right? Like all of these things, when we use this language, that's dehumanizing, which makes it easier to then actually commit, actual like mass murder. But again, let's say we can argue about numbers or whatever, but okay, so let's say it's not a genocide. What possibility do they have? Like that, all of Gaza is destroyed. The environment, homes, infrastructure, right? The amount of destruction, like there's no possibility to go back there and live really. And so whether or not the numbers of dead bodies counts as genocide, killing a whole area and land of people, that's innately genocide, right? Like I
Yeah, and that's the thing that gets me. I think because at least in the conversations that I've had with folks that are very tied to like some sort of ownership of genocide post the Holocaust, of like
Mm,
genocide is very precious. Like that word seems to be very precious because it's
mm,
very attached to a horrific thing that happened that many people can tie like directly just a few generations, a couple generations to, is that it's a really deep fixation on the death and the number
mm.
and sort of like the quantitative aspects of it.
The percentage, right? It has to like,
It
I
has
keep hearing, well, um, Palestinians have had this much growth, over the last so many years, so it can't
yeah,
possibly be a genocide. I'm like, "So then what
or like
number? Like, what number is
it's like, what number? There's like, well, it's only 30,000. It's only 10,000.
it's
It's
only
only
this percent." I feel
100.
like they use percentage to,
Yeah.
like, lessen the blow, right?
And I think something happened similarly in Sudan, in Darfur in the 90s, where a lot of people were like, this is very clearly a genocide because literally this entire culture is being wiped away. And people were like,
Mhm.
but it's only like 10,000 people. And I'm like, no, it's like
Mm,
growing and growing. Um, but I think there's like a really, really deep seated fixation on that of the millions, right? Like
mhm,
we are talking in the Holocaust in the millions. And right now we're like in the thousands. So there's like this
mm,
like differentiation and this sort of like, yes, I think there's also a really big fixation on the intent, but I think when people are trying to define genocide, they immediately go to it's a numbers game and it's
mm,
because what's really interesting and maybe slightly controversial and maybe messy, and I'm thinking out loud, is that Jewish culture actually ended up flourishing. And
mm,
so it still is in existence. So while there was a genocide and a very direct attack, unlike African culture, let's say,
mm,
in the United States, we as Jews, I literally just yesterday read a book that has been read for centuries,
mm,
down, that is still in existence. For Palestinians, what I fear is like when you see like this entire family line has been wiped,
yes,
there will not be
yes.
200 years from now, possibly, Palestinians gathering together, reading a text that has been handed down forever.
Which I think
That's
too
not to
gets
diminish the Holocaust, I feel like I have to say that, but I'm
yeah.
saying, like, if we just fixate on the numbers, it almost doesn't really work either because
Yeah,
we've
and
been
I
able
think
to keep that.
I think you're right. I think we have to say, right, this is not about diminishing the genocide. In fact, it's to say we need to expand what counts as genocide because it can
Mhm,
be so easy to just be like, well, that doesn't count. And yet, like you said, this generational knowledge is being erased. And I think that, for somebody who, has Mexican ancestry and
mhm.
I can only trace my family lineage back so far because of colonization, right? And
Mhm.
then it gets real messy, right? Like, is it European? Is it indigenous? Is it like,
Yeah,
where
that's
did
what,
that
like,
get,
and we have that conversation
mixed up?
a lot here because like, and we feel lucky
Mhm.
to, as Jews of color, you know, me being Mexican, my husband being black, we have at least a culture that we feel rooted in that goes
Mm,
far back, because if we divorce ourselves from our Jewishness, neither one of us can trace back a lineage of knowledge very many generations. I could
right.
probably have more success because I was born in Mexico in finding, like, my lineage there, but
Mm,
even still, it's completely the indigenous parts of it are completely
mhm,
erased because of that colonial
right.
system there,
And
and
and genocide, right? To me, that's cultural
it is
genocide.
cultural
When we
genocide, like, I
when
don't
you
know my
yeah,
indigenous roots, and I might not ever be able to find out necessarily,
yeah,
and my husband, we are able to trace his family to Louisiana, and that's it. Like, we
yeah,
don't know what
yeah,
happened before then. There's nothing.
yeah,
There's no cultural remnants from his ancestors that he can carry,
yeah,
except for those that were colonized and enslaved, which is
right.
not
And it's still fishy it's still shaky at best, right? Like those kinds of records, right?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and I think that's the part too we have to talk about like cultural and spiritual genocide when, you know, we're seeing in Gaza things like mosques, right, being
Mhm.
destroyed, and imagining like what kinds of knowledge and information is housed in those buildings, right? Like or but like
Yeah.
it's just
It's
books are being burned quite
books are being
literally.
as a Jewish person who, like, again, I said benefits and feels so much privilege from the ability to be like, we know that these rabbis were at B'nai B'rach in like whatever century arguing about how long the Seder was going to be. Like we have
Mm,
documentation, we have people
mhm,
having written this stuff down. It's if as an immigrant, as like somebody living in the diaspora, I feel so lucky to have that.
mhm,
And that is what propels me to go and speak up for, well, everyone should have that right.
mm,
Everyone should have that ability. Yes, let's talk about the numbers of people that are being murdered, have been murdered, but how can we guarantee that other people can have the same privilege that we do so that generation after generation, they're able to solidify these traditions?
yeah.
I mean, and that's what was, like, spoken about during the Seder. It was like, um, we were just talking back and forth about, like, there's this is a slight tangent, but I'll get to a point. Um, there's people that believe that there were Hebrews in Egypt, and there's people that believe that there were never any Hebrews in Egypt. So the
Mm,
conversation our host did a wonderful job of, like, guiding us through these arguments and, like, being like, "Where do you land? What do you think?"
mm,
And one of the other guests was like, "Well," they were able to find, like, the original what we call the books of Moses, but there was one that very specifically talks about like the time of Egypt, but doesn't mention anything else about the Seder. Like there's nothing included about like
mm,
Passover, but they've determined through science and blah, 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 carbon dating that that is like the first one. And someone was
mm,
like, why don't we just use that book? Like, why
mm,
can't we just go by that? And then somebody else responded with like, but then we wouldn't have this. Like, we
mm,
wouldn't be able to all be sitting here together, we wouldn't be talking, about tradition, like, we wouldn't have it. Somebody thousands of years ago was like, "We're not gonna use this one, we're gonna use this one," and as a result, for 2,000 years, or however many thousands of years, we've been able to do this one thing, which is so valuable and precious because look at us,
yeah.
here
And
we are
that's like
together.
that's cultural preservation, right? The
Yeah,
idea of like how do we preserve culture? Um, and I think
and
that
I
that's so important, like you said, because as people who have, colonized ancestry, I mean, this is why I say colonization is an ongoing project because it continues to work itself out, right? Like,
Mhm.
I always get really frustrated. Not that I'm doing a good job of teaching my kids Spanish, but
Let's
I
not talk about that.
but I think it's so interesting that there's for generations, right, people were told not to teach their kids Spanish because it was, and I have personal experiences with friends of mine who were blatantly told by doctors not to speak Spanish to their children because it was going to create blah blah. I mean, crazy stories that, I'm always like, let me show you the research on this actually. But then there's like this Spanish immersion school in Long Beach that is in a white neighborhood, right? That like everybody's trying to get into. And so I'm like, I think it's really interesting, right? Like, and that's cooptation, that's gentrification, right? Like, so, you erase the culture from us, right? But now you
Yeah.
can sort of co-opt this culture and this idea. And I think there's even um because cultural genocide is not even just about erasure, but it's also the idea of creating that hierarchy,
Mhm.
right? To say, like, well, you can keep your culture, but our culture is still better,
Mhm.
right? And this is assimilation comes into this, right? Plays into
Mhm.
this. This is the idea of like as an immigrant, right? Like you have to assimilate into
Mhm.
American culture, right? And whatever American culture actually is. But I think so genocide is also like subjugating, exotifying, otherizing,
Yeah.
inferiorizing all other cultures. And I think that when we a lot of the rhetoric that I've been hearing around Israel is this idea that Israel is the only democratic country, right, in the middle, and it's preserving West values.
Mhm.
And I saw this video with Chelsea Handler
Oh gosh.
where she talks about it, and I was like, I'm just gonna read what I wrote about her. She says, when Chelsea Handler argues for the need to preserve Western values in the Middle East, she positions herself as somehow superior to non-Western people, which is the very definition of racism, right? This idea, and I think she sort of alludes to things like gay marriage and LGBTQ rights and like all of these things as Western values, right? So she assumes that ideologies of sexual freedom, freedoms of speech are somehow uniquely Western, even though history proves that, in fact, most indigenous populations around the world, and we said it already today, right, embrace sexual and gender freedoms throughout history. It was not until European colonization that imposed puritanical sexual and gender social norms in order to uphold patriarchal white supremacist power structures. So Western values do not inherently hold some moral high ground, and to argue they do is racist by definition. So I
Yeah.
think that like that just really bothered me when she was like, "Oh, we need to support Israel because they're maintaining Western values." And I was like, what the fuck? You actually said that out loud? Like this Western values? What are these Western values?
I mean, the cognitive dissonance is so high, but yeah, I just the people it's so much. I mean, you really kind of nailed it in what you just read.
Yeah, I mean, I again, like for me hearing that, it's like she's not even trying to pretend
Mhm.
that she's not racist, right? Because and even this idea of like the West and we need to preserve democracy. I'm like, first of all, we act as if the United States is fucking getting democracy right.
Correct. Yeah.
I'm like, what are you even talking about? Like, we can't even do hello. Didn't Trump deny like that the election was real? Like, we can't even, we're
You
not
can't
getting democracy
you're
right. So we
no,
have no right to try to go and impose democracy on anybody, right?
no.
Or to try to preserve that anywhere.
Yeah, no, I don't even know what we're trying to preserve. I it's like, it's not working, guys.
Right, it's not working. So I think like and again to me like those are all whether or not we're talking about the numbers of bodies or the numbers of people, dying, these are all telltale signs of colonization. These are all telltale signs of cultural genocide, right? Of spiritual genocide, of
And again,
ideological genocide.
like, I think it's worth saying as many times possible is that genocide, I think, is a direct byproduct of colonization.
Mhm, 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 mhm.
Like, one cannot exist without the other.
Because it goes back to the idea of protecting freedom and safety,
Mhm,
right? That in order to protect the freedom and safety of colonizers,
mhm.
you have to kill everybody else.
Yeah, it doesn't work. It just you can't have one without the other. If it was and I can't I'm trying to remember where I read it or who I can give credit to. Anytime I read anything about genocide, it's probably Zoe Samudzi, who
Mhm,
is a genocide scholar, and I'm such a big fan. But, um, you don't just kill a person based on their own identity or their individuality. It's that group, right? Because together, all of these people threaten the project that you're trying to bring in.
mm,
Like, you can't yeah, like, one has to supplant the other, which, however you wanna play it out, usually ends up in
mhm,
the erasure, disappearance, displacement. I think
mhm,
displacement is also a big part
mhm,
of genocide. Like you
mhm,
said, you're moving people away. You can't come back. where you have to go sort of like I don't even know if you could say start over. So like I've heard so many people be like, "Well, the Palestinians can just go live in Egypt." And like start over there. I'm like, "What are they going to do there?" And also, great, sure, you are now just ensuring that again, their culture, their ties, everything else that's of value to you is erased for them, taken
I
away from them.
It's like when people say that out loud, I'm like, "Did you just hear yourself?" Like, how that's a very strange thing. Well, why doesn't Egypt just take them? I'm like, Why don't you just let them why can't they just stay
Why
where
can't
they're
you just
at?"
stay?
I don't it's or they'll say like, "Well, why are they so adamant about staying?" And, if I was in danger, I would try to get out. And I'm like, I don't know, like those just I don't know. It's just it feels very strange, like when you sort of unpack these things in the reality. And I think us again knowing, these the context of colonialism in these other places, the United States, all of Latin America, and both of us kind of being these doubly, triply colonized people, were like, we know colonization when we see it.
Yeah.
Right? These are all the telltale signs. And like you said, it's really hard to wrap your head around, right? It is really hard. I mean, I will say that, when I was a kid, 4th of July was my favorite holiday. I loved, this idea of like America, and all of this stuff. And then when I started learning the reality, you kind of get hit in the face with like, oh shit,
Yeah,
like this romantic story that I've been told my entire life is not true.
not
And
true.
then you have to make a choice. I think
Yeah, I
you
was
make
gonna
the
say,
choice.
back to yeah, well, you have to make a choice, like, I'm just thinking about when I was going through the citizenship process, the
Oh, right.
naturalization
I'm like, you
process,
probably know a lot of history
and I'm like, I
more
mean,
than
it's
I do.
the test is stuff that you learn in elementary school, but it's all of these sort of like, again, foundational myths that they
Mhm.
want you to recite to prove how American you are. Like, besides like, disavowing any allegiance to anywhere else, it's like, do you know how awesome George Washington was? And are you able to say that in English that is understandable? Because that's the two things that you need to survive as a US citizen. Like, be able to like rep George Washington and say it clearly and, like,
Yeah,
um, yeah, without an accent preferably, but, they allow accents, I guess.
yeah.
But it was a choice, and to have to, like, go through and make that choice and go, "Ugh, I'm making this choice because it's going to make my life easier,"
Mm.
but
Mm.
also I mean, that's the reason why don't kick me out, but that's the reason why I did it, of, like, oh, I don't have to go meet in a random office every couple of years and let them know what I'm up to if
Mm.
I just do this test. And
Yeah.
then you sit there and you have to watch a video of, like, when you do the actual ceremony with, like, people from all over the world, um, watching, an eagle fly over the United States. It's, like, the most with, like, your little American flag.
I've seen images of, yeah, the big moment, when
But it's a
people
choice, and then you come out of that and go, "Wait a minute, you
and
promised me all these things, like, just now, just this minute you just
and you, like,
said."
walk out and you're like, "Wait a minute." I mean, and I wanted to be clear too because, you know, what we're saying really at the end of the day in terms of national myths is like there is no national mythology that should be romanticized because
Yeah,
let's be clear, the
no.
Mexican national mythology is
No.
equally as problematic,
I
right?
feel
Like
sometimes that it's, like, worse because I'm like, you'll, like, ride hard on this idea that you're all about indigeneity and you're so proud of all of these, like,
the
Mexica
Aztec, yeah,
symbols and, like, all of this stuff, and then at the end of the day, you're like, but if you're an Indio, get off the bus."
right.
Like
That's the thing, right? But in fact, they get to say that because it's part of their national mythology, right? They get to say, "We love indigenous people. It's part of our national mythology," while they are like literally disenfranchising them.
yeah,
And they're living in like all of these things, like and still erasing indigenous culture, right? Like it's this
yeah.
kind of weird thing that on one hand they're romanticizing this very narrow version of indigeneity, though, right? Like, let's just say that,
It's
like,
very narrow, but I do feel like Mexico, like here in the United States, you have this idea of like the noble savage, and there
mm,
is this like sort of like myth of that's why you get people wear headdresses because you're like
mm,
romanticizing what it is, and you want to feel like you are of this land, and so
mm.
therefore you can wear moccasins
You
and like
become native,
you
right?
become
You
native, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
But I
yeah.
feel like Mexico is still so like, they're still extracting
Mhm.
from the remains of indigenous knowledge. Here, at the very least, like, sadly, there's reservations and they're, like, left alone, I guess. Like,
Yeah, it's
in
sort
a
of out
very
of sight,
sad
out of
way, like
mind.
yeah, out of sight, out of mind. They've become very invisible, where in Mexico, they're very visible
Mhm,
and knowledge is still being constantly pulled from
mhm.
them while, like, also sort of trying to erase it. I don't know.
Yeah. So,
That's
I
a
mean, this is
whole
all to say is, like,
uh,
where I think our it's an overarching critique of nationalism, recognizing that nationalism as a concept is colonization, is
yeah,
inherently colonization. So, we're not here to support any type of nationalist project because it is inherently embedded within colonialism. And again, that's why the critique of the state of Israel, right?
yeah,
Israel as a nation
mhm,
is the critique, right?
yeah,
It's the
and
critique
I
of
think you
Israel
and
as a
I
nation state.
have said that, I think, since day 1 of, like, we're critiquing Israel because we critique all nations. Like, that's it, bottom
Yeah,
line.
they're critiquing the idea of nationalism, and so when we say like why how is Israel colonialist? Because they are a nation state.
Yeah,
That's it. They
that's
don't
it.
even have to be doing nothing.
No, just by the mere existence of them
As a nation
as a
state,
nation
right? Because we
state.
can talk about Israel as an indigenous territory, as a biblical
And not the biblical
right, like, we can
nation.
talk about all those
Yeah,
things. The contemporary nation state of Israel, you know, um, that's the critique, right? Because nation states are inherently a colonial project.
yeah,
And I think that's where we can finish.
yeah.
Oh gosh, I think we did good.
That's good. Whew.
Alrighty, we'll see everyone next
Yeah.
time.
Bye.